Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. In today's video, I'm going to go over the RLE Technologies F200. It's their small little plug-and-play monitoring appliance. So I'll go over updating it from its default IP address. We'll get it put onto my office network. And then I have a few plug-and-play sensors for temp, humidity, water leak detection input, and some dry contact inputs that we can set up onto this unit. So starting off, I'm using a Windows 10 PC. So you have a few different options depending on how you wanted to configure this. You could have a laptop with a internal NIC. You could use a tablet with one of the external Ethernet dongles to be able to plug in a network cable to, or you can go through and use a PC like I'm going to do. So with Windows 10, you have some flexibility depending on how you want to update the IP on your NIC. So you can come down here and we can see right now that I have no internet on the unidentified network. So I'm just going to right click, then left click on the open network and internet settings. So when it opens up to this page, there's two methods we can go about changing this. We can come down to the properties under this network, which is my LAN connection. Up above here, that's the Wi-Fi, so we don't want to be changing that. Or we could go through and we can do the Ethernet. So real quick, just clicking on the properties. So we left click. Then we see IP settings. Then we can click on the edit. And then from here, we can change it to be similar to the default IP address of 10.0.0.188 from RLE Technologies. So we could always change this to like 10.0.0.180. Another method, depending on your preference, you can left click on Ethernet off on the left hand side. And then over on the upper right hand side, you can left click on change adapter options. So when this opens up and identifies, I know that this is the network connection that I would want to be updating the properties to. If you're ever unsure, you can always disconnect that Ethernet cable going to the F200, which the F200 you would have to have plugged in. And you can see when it's disconnected, it gives us a little disconnect symbol. So I'm going to plug this back in, reestablish its link. And then while that's working on identifying, I'm just going to right click on this network name, come down to properties, left click on Internet Protocol version 4, the IPv4. Just left click on that, left click on properties. And then here we can see my home office 192.168. So here I'll change this to 10.0.0, and I'll leave the 20 in place on there. And then on this, we can actually leave blank. If you have multiple LAN connections onto a PC, it's not recommended to have multiple gateway assignments. So we'll get that updated, click on OK, click on close. Then this will just minimize for now because we're going to come back to here. Minimize, minimize. Now I'll open up my web browser. So in this case, I'm going to use Chrome. And then we'll type in that default IP address of 10.0.0.188. Push enter. And you can see it brings us to the home screen of the F200 unit. So first screen you see is the dashboard. So what we want to do is click on setup. So you just hover over setup, left click, and then I'll get this programmed to go onto the network, and then we'll do all the rest of the changes with it operational on the network. So device name, you can type inside this field, and this field is up to 18 characters, including spaces. Anytime you start typing, you'll see the field go green, and then if you get too far with a name or something's inaccurate, it'll go red. So in this one, I'm going to update it. And I already have a static IP claimed off from my network that I can assign to this. So I'm going to go 192.168.1.227. The /24 subnet mask, that works for my network, so I don't need to update that. I'm sure your IT department will update you with whatever the proper settings are if that was going to be different from that standard Class C. And then we come down to the gateway and we update this from that 10 dot to 192.168.1.1. And while we're in here, I'm going to also update my DNS. All right, now that we have all those things updated, we can see all the fields that we changed is green. If you were doing a NetBIOS on the discovery, you can update this on here. Commonly, it's the serial number off from the unit from RLE Technologies. And then as far as the overall setup, we're going to be using the static IP, but if you wanted to use a DHCP for maintaining this unit, you could select this here. So I'm going to click on Save Settings. The little save button goes away, so that shows that it took the changes. So now I'm going to pause momentarily and I'm going to unplug this from my computer and then get it plugged over onto my demo wall and get it residing on my 192.168 network. So just one moment. Okay, I'm back. So now I have that plugged into my network, but I need to go back and update the NIC setting on my PC so I can actually talk to that subnet. Reopen these windows. So I'm going to right click back on that Oscar network, come down to properties, left click, go back to the IPv4, left click on properties, and we'll just update this again. 192.168.1.1. Click on OK, click on close. It's identifying. Click on close, and there it's established its link. We'll close on this. So now I should be able to go to this IP. There it is. If you're ever seeing something odd with some behavior patterns, opening up a command prompt and doing a simple ping, making sure that the device is responding back properly. It helps if I put the right IP address in. So nice consistent response. So we'll just close this. So now I'll go back over. So at this point, I can go into setup and start configuring my sensors, or I can start plugging in all those peripherals. So on this, I have 2 temp humidities and I have 2 temps. So the temp humidity is represented by a blue shell on the end of the sensor, and the temperature is represented by a red shell on the end of the sensor. So I have a temp humidity going into 1. All right, pre-labeled all these things on my demo board. So you see once I plug this in, that sensor pulls up right away. So now we got sensor number 2, which is a temp. You should just see the 1 analog value. And then we have, get my routing straightened out, temperature input for number 3. Last but not least, temperature humidity input on sensor 4. And you can do any combination. You could have 4 temps plugged into the F200, 4 temp humidities, or a mix match, depending on how you want to plug them into the channels. So while I'm also by this, I'm going to plug in my dry contact leads that I have from some little power fail relays and a leak detection cable input, where I have a 25-foot section of cable that we'll test with. All right, now that that's all plugged in, now we can go in and set up our sensors. So we can left click on the setup. So from this network tab, we already updated everything with our network setup. We can see our current configuration shown on the bottom left-hand side. Time settings, I'm going to utilize the NTP server. This is where if you had an internal or a preferred NTP that you wanted to hook to, you can put in either the host name or the IP. I'm going to keep that, and I'm just going to correct this to the right time zone. Mountain Time in the United States, set that to -7. Keep daylight savings, click on save. You're going to get a warning that it's going to erase the logs, which is fine. We're just starting off. Okay, we have that updated. So then next we're going to go through and update our sensors. So I'm going to left click on the second tab, Sensors, and here we can see this 4 sensor ports being called out, and it's showing under the sensor type as far as that style of sensor. Just starting off, I'm not going to adjust any of the thresholds. I'm going to let this trend for a little while. Then I'll go back once I know what my proper high and low settings would be in order to make those adjustments. So here I'll go through and I'll update names. This is demo switch. TH. It's on the demo board. You can see here, if you wanted to fine tune, once it's been trending for a little while, you can go through and you actually can apply an offset for the temperature displayed reading, the humidity displayed reading. You can set your above and under thresholds for your temperature, humidity, and you can also control how the unit is going to alarm. Is it, going to send out a sound, driving the LED light, sending an email, triggering the external relay, or do you only want one of these to take place? Starting off, I'm just going to leave all 4 of those enabled. So I'm going to click on Save Settings. Once that saves, then I'll go over to sensor port 2. This one I have mounted above a 24-volt DC power supply. So I'm going to go power supply temp. It's also on the demo board. Same thing, I'm not going to touch any of these settings. I'm going to let it trend for a little while, then we'll go back and adjust it. All right, that one took. So then the next one is this sensor input number 3, which is just the office temperature. Also mounted on the demo board. Keep all the other settings the same. Click on Save. And the last one is an outdoor temp humidity sensor. I have mounted outside of my window. Outdoor T and H. Office window, and same thing. We'll just leave all these settings at their default for now. Once we have some good trend data, then we'll go through and tweak them. Inputs. Starting off on the upper left-hand side, there's a leak detection input. So by default, it's disabled. So we're going to set this to enabled. And you can see once we set that, it gives us a name for the leak cable. We'll leave it at the default leak cable number 1. By default, it starts on low sensitivity or least sensitive. So this takes the most amount of water. So just starting off default wise, we'll set it to medium, and then we'll fine tune it after that. Same with all the alarm actions. We'll have it driving all the bells and whistles out of the gate as far as any leak alarm inputs, cable breaks. So then we'll click on Save Settings. The digital inputs, you can update the name on here, which is 19 characters. I'm just going to leave it at the default settings for now. And I have this alternating between open and closed as far as how it's going to handle that alarm action. So here, my first one is an open contact. And you can see the other options that you can set it open. So when it goes an alarm, it latches, or closed, it would latch. And then once it's in that alarm state, you'll see the button kind of highlight or grayed out down here. You would have to click on that to clear it. So we're going to go open. And this is like every other. Open and open. And then notification, lots of options. You want just a sound, a light, an email, a relay, and then you start getting into your combinations or all the above. So we're just going to make it drive all alerts. That way if an alarm happens, someone should be aware of it. All right, save on that. And then next, these links are really handy if you had like network cameras or other devices you wanted to link to. That's where if you come through here, you can set it to enabled, and then you can actually update the name for what that device is, preferably like a camera in a hallway office. You can put in the static URL as far as for that image that would be shown on the dashboard page. And then you can actually put a link URL to where you can actually click on that image from the main page, and it opens up a new tab and then routes you directly to that camera so you can get to the streaming source. There is a selectable refresh rate or frames per second. So default it's set to 1 frame per second. That's where you can go as high up to 30 frames per second. I'm going to just set that back to disabled. I don't have any cameras to link up to this currently. All right, save on that. So then next, when we come down through on our options, we have email notification. So we're going to make this drive as many alerts as we can. So I'm going to take this and set it to enabled. Recipients, you can have up to 8 in this field. So that's where we just do put in my generic email for the company. Server, only custom is from that drop down. From, this would be the from address for the unit. Depending on how your SMTP server is configured, lots of times you have to be a valid sender address as far as coming from this unit for helping with authentication. I'm using a straight SMTP relay in this example. So my from is just this SMTP server. This is where you can put in either the host name or the IP of that SMTP relay. So I'm going to go 192.168.1.29. Your SMTP port, standard port 25 for basic SMTP. But if you start dealing with authenticated, TLS, SSL, depending on the connection path, depending on the information you get back from your IT, or if you're going through like an Outlook, a Gmail, you can look up that port information. Authentication, in this case, I'm not using authentication, so I'm just going to set this to disabled. Otherwise, if we needed that, we'd leave it to enabled. And then RLE also added in an encryption type based on that authentication. If requiring authentication, your registered username and password for that account. I'm going to leave this one in place to show an example of this full summary HTML based email, and then I'll switch it over to the short, because if you select from the drop down, you can see then there's a short, alarm text only, and then there's a long full summary text only. So we'll leave that set to the HTML. And I am an advocate of getting the RTNs or return to normals coming back to you after an event has occurred. So we'll leave that set to enabled. But if you didn't want a return to normal email notification, then you can just disable it. Click on save. So now that that's gone through, what I can do is I can actually click on the send test email. And this goes pretty quick. You see it automatically pops up that little dialog. Then I'll open up my email. Most SMTP relays, generally within 10 to 15 seconds, you should see the alerts and everything rounding through. So I'm going to come over to here. I'm going to open up my test email. There's an example of what a test email from the HTML format looks like from an F200, where you get the host name of the device, a quick hyperlink to be able to click and pull up the web interface, and then you see a breakdown of your analog sensors, your dry contact inputs, leak detection, and the relay output. So you just get some base status coming off from here. And then if you wanted to go more simple, you can do short alarm. You save that. Click on send test email. Email sent. Once that sends through, you get it pulled up. You can see very basic alarm message coming through. So I'm going to set this back over to the HTML base. So next, going through the options, you can have your units being displayed in either English or metric. So I'm going to keep it set to English. The relay, you can actually set it to disabled or have it enabled. So not only can you click on a button interface through the home screen, but you can also update the label based on the closed button status, open button status, the closed text being displayed, and the open text being displayed. I'm going to keep it set to these defaults so we don't have to make any changes on here. Next on the bottom left is the trending and logging. So I'm going to set this up for enabled, and then I'll keep it at that default 10-second as far as for the rate. Web refresh, we'll keep that set to enabled, and event logging, I'm going to enable this. And then if you're ever going through and you wanted to clear out one of these units as far as the back history, you can actually click on clear history and clear out all that previous data. So we'll click on save. And then for communication to an NMS, BMS, EPMS, DSIM, depending on what you're doing, you have two protocols options on the output. You can use SNMP or you can use Modbus TCP. So SNMP, as soon as you set that to enable, you can update the community string. If you were to send a trap, the trap type, whether it's a V1 or V2C, you can put in system contact. So mine, I'm gonna put in my name, and then office. And then you can even send a test trap out to that NMS software. So this, I'm actually going to go back and disable it because I'm not going to use SNMP for my interface. I'm going to use the Modbus TCP, where you can have up to like 2 masters pulling this via the TCP connection. So I'm going to go enabled, use the default port 502, click on save. Once it saves, then I can click on view registers. And then here you can see a call out of all the holding register sets going through with the holding register number, the value that would be read from that register point, and then a quick description of that point. So you can see all the different holding registers available from the F200. So we can close out this tab. And then the last tab is your admin. You can click on this. From here, you could upload firmware. If you wanted to remote power cycle the unit, you got to reboot it for whatever reason, you can actually remote reboot. If you were trying to identify this F200 within a rack of devices, you can actually click on this to where it'll actually start blinking the LED and start beeping. And I'll click on this real quick because you can hear it in the background. And then last but not least, your users. As far as once people come in on the system, you can have it fairly open. You can go through and set it to where to make any changes, someone would have to log in, or where someone always has to log in. And then from here, you can do up to 8 users coming through on the system. So you can just click on add, and then you can update, you can change the default credentials around. So whatever you wanted to do from that setting. I'm actually going to add a user, put this. This I'm going to just change from a default. Perfect. Now that we have those all updated, now I could go back over to the dashboard And then when we look back at the home screen, now we can see as far as our analog sensors, our dry contact inputs, our relay that we can actually click on. You can see it flipping state around, our leak detection cable, and our analog sensor inputs. So I'm going to disconnect my leader cable. I'm going to take the EOL off from the end of the leader. That way it generates a cable break alarm. So you can hear it beeping in the background. Silence it. So here I'm going to generate a cable break alarm. I'm going to remove the end-of-line terminator from the leader cable for that leak detection input. So we go through and disconnect the EOL. You can see that it represents a busted cable. Shows that through, so I just silenced it. So now I'll take the leader cable, we'll plug it into the leak detection cable. All right, now I have my cable hooked up. You can see that we got a green check mark going through the graphic. So now I'm just going to put a little bit of water on that leak detection cable. For sometimes the first time you go to put it in water, sometimes it takes a little bit to wick up. And this one actually picked up right away. Perfect. All right. So then if we take it out of the water, tap it dry, take a cloth, wipe it down. We'll silence the alarm. And sometimes, depending on air movement and other things around the cable, might take a little bit to dry out. And then here we can also see on the bottom right of my screen, the email alerts coming through. And we are back to a normal state. So one of the last things to look at this little F200 unit, depending on outputting on the logs, you'll notice you have a scroll bar at the bottom of this trend window. So when you hover over, you get the little ticks that are represented by different colors that are shown off on the right-hand side with our date and timestamp. This is where you can actually download a log in a CSV format or sensor trend value. Click on back. And that is the F200. So at this point, we could go through and we could gracefully log out from the unit. And then now, because we updated it, it requires a login for viewing anything. So we'll put in that. We'll put in our password, log in. We're off to the races. Save that password for future use. So thank you for your time. Hope this was informative and hope you have a great day.